Powell Chapter 7, Dealing with Sexuality in the Workplace. This is only one half of this chapter. These lectures will be broken into separate parts. Please be very careful and know that Powell Chapter 7 has more than one video lecture. I love this quote by Judge Damon Keith. I do wish that I could change the word woman to person, but you can't change a quote, so it'll have to go the way it is. The relevant inquiry at hand is what the reasonable woman would find offensive, not society, which at one point also condoned slavery. And I think this is a really important thing to remember when you're looking at sexual harassment. It is sometimes easy to say, oh, don't be ridiculous, it's not that big of a deal. Just remember, how many years ago in our society did we believe that owning other human beings was perfectly acceptable? How will we be viewed 100, 200 years from now when people look back at some of the beliefs we hold and some of the things that we do based on those beliefs? I mean, will it be as repugnant and repulsive to them as it is to us to look back at slave owners? So, as you're going through this chapter, if you ever find yourself having the tendency to think, oh, it's just not that big of a deal, I want you to think about this quote, because maybe it really is that big of a deal, but maybe our society has condoned some behaviors for so long that we actually think that the behavior is acceptable. So first of all, we need to define sexual harassment and sexual discrimination. Now remember, we had discrimination in another chapter. Discrimination is different, okay? That's refusing to hire, promote, transfer somebody based upon their sex, okay? That's discrimination. That is a hiring practice. It is not sexual harassment. Sexual harassment, on the other hand, unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature constitutes sexual harassment when submission to such conduct is made either explicitly or implicitly a term or condition of an individual's employment. Okay, the magic word you want to look for in here is implicit. Okay, maybe it wasn't specifically said, however, it was insinuated, and the employee came to believe that it was a term or condition of their employment, even if it was not explicitly stated. And that one is very important to watch out for. Submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as the basis for employment decisions. Okay, so they were told, or even if they weren't told, that they had to submit to this, and if they did, then they had a favorable outcome in their employment. But if they rejected it, there was a negative outcome to their employment. And such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. Again, another really important part is we're going to talk about the fact there's actually two different types of sexual harassment, and one of them has to do with this statement about creating an intimidating, hostile work environment. Okay? Now, the two types of harassment that are actionable under Title VII of the Constitution: quid pro quo. Okay, quid pro quo, a Latin term that means something for something. Quid pro quo harassment means you have sex with me and I will give you a promotion or a raise. Okay, that is something for something. Whereas hostile environment is an environment that's created in the workplace. Sexual jokes, nasty magazines, off-color comments, all of these things added together can create a hostile work environment. Quid pro quo is by far the worst form, I say worst as in liability, of sexual harassment, because employers are held to very, very strict standards on quid pro quo, and I think you can see why. This is actual sexual behaviors. If you don't have sex with me, you don't get the job. If you don't have sex with me, you won't get a promotion, type of thing. Now, employers are liable, obviously, if they knew about it, but even if they should have known about it. Okay, so basically what was happening is an employer would get sued for quid pro quo, and they would say, well, we had no idea what's going on. Had we known, we would have done something about it. Well, the courts say, you know what? No more excuses. Because, if you skip down here to the bottom real quick, the people that work for you, your supervisors, are an agent of the employer. That person was chosen by the employer to represent the employer, and the employer gave them authority. Therefore, even if you try and claim, I didn't know, too bad. The employee that's being accused, if they're a supervisor, is an agent of the employer. You know what? Too bad. You should have known. You are the person, you put this person in charge, you judge their character, you are supposed to have trained them, you should have been watching them, and you should have known. Okay? Employers still have strict liability, even if they say, but we had a policy. We told them not to do that. It's in writing. Okay? That's not enough. That is not enough to, again, it's something that an employer could hide behind. Absolutely not. That person is an agent of the employer. Therefore, the employer is indeed responsible for their behavior. Hostile working environment is different. Okay? There are 3 harassment conditions that can create a hostile working environment. It must be on the basis of gender, and it's not necessarily the opposite sex. When people think about sexual harassment, the average person, and again, we always talk about the prototypes that you have in your head, will think about a man harassing a woman. However, that's not necessarily true, and there are cases, many cases, of women being harassers, of women harassing not only men, but other women, of men harassing other men. So, on the basis of gender, they don't have to be 2 employees of the opposite sex. Was unwelcomed by the victim. Okay, you guys, this one is really important. So you're at work and they start telling some jokes that you know shouldn't be told, and the average person just gets very uncomfortable and kind of goes, okay, and they just want to get away from it. Okay, that doesn't mean you welcomed it. It just meant that you were uncomfortable and you didn't know what to do. And by the way, that is what the average person does. They just, holy cow, I don't want to be part of this, and try and move away from it. The problem comes in when you start laughing at those jokes, or when you start actually participating in it and maybe telling some of your own because you want to fit in, and then it goes too far and then you file a claim. What's going to happen is you're going to lose because you were participating at some point. You do not get to participate in this type of behavior, then suddenly say, I don't like this, and file a complaint, because all that's going to happen is the other people involved are simply going to point at you and say, are you kidding? This person was an active participant. Therefore, their claim is invalid. Okay? The courts may see the victim felt powerless to stop the advances, even though, notice it says she, it should say the employee, did not report them. Because, again, the average person does not want to report this. They don't want to cause trouble. They just want to do their job. And usually, sexual harassment goes on for a very long time before the victim actually reports it. And it has to affect a term or condition of employment. It does not have to be so bad that you literally can't do your job, but it has to be enough is going on that you are very uncomfortable and it is affecting your ability to work to an extent, to the best of your ability, but not to the point where you literally can't go to work. So again, this has to do with it went on for a while, and they're going to say, yeah, well, she says it's been, or he says it's been going on for 6 months, but they've been doing their job just fine. You know what? That's not the point. Just because the average person doesn't say something out loud, they may be suffering in silence and simply keeping their mouth shut out of fear or for whatever reason, and they feel powerless to stop it. So these are the 3 harassment conditions that create a hostile working environment. There's no strict liability because this is very much subject to the person's perception. What one person thinks is terribly harassing, another may not. Therefore, when you are looking at hostile working environment, because there's so many variables and perception involved, the courts don't have strict liability. So If your employer finds this is going on, they intervene swiftly and appropriately. It really does mitigate the damage. Insufficient response is worse than none. So basically, we knew what was going on and we didn't do anything about it, or we didn't really take it seriously and do much about it. It was a quick hand slap and a wink, wink, nudge, nudge type of thing. That's worse than doing nothing. And I want to give you an example of someone that I worked with who filed against somebody and filed a complaint. And I worked for a very large corporation, huge manufacturing plant. Therefore, inter-office mail was quite an undertaking. The little person rode around on a bike with mail in the back of a basket because the place was so large. So we had mail zone designations, right? Like addresses. So maybe you worked in section 1D. So they would address the mail to you, your name, and then it would say section 1D to tell the mail person where to take it. Makes sense, right? Well, I happen to work in section 4Q. Say it quickly. 4Q. Yeah. So, of course, somebody's going to be silly and make some silly joke about it. So there we were one day at work, and unfortunately I had to work with somebody who was, gosh, it has nothing to do with her religion whatsoever, but if you ever saw Saturday Night Live and you ever saw the church lady, yeah, that's who I worked with, only she was much younger than that. And basically what that means is someone who's so rigid and incapable of accepting other people and is constantly looking for a way to be insulted. Yeah, that's who I worked with. So there we were. 2 women in a manufacturing plant working with, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 guys standing around. We finished the project we were working on. Thank you, bye, bye, bye. And the church lady says, yeah, go ahead and mail me that, whatever. And the guy, of course, says, okay, what's your mail zone? And she says 4Q. And he laughs and says, oh, yeah, well, 4Q too, lady. And then they all laughed. Well, having worked with her, oh, man, I'm like, this guy's dead. Sure enough, she filed a complaint. And that would be considered under hostile environment. And it was found, of course, to be invalid silliness. However, know that the employer still had to call the man in to sit him down. This all had to be recorded. Records were kept, and he was told not to do it again. Now, he wasn't truly in trouble because they knew that this person obviously had some issues with everything. She constantly turned in these complaints. But, you know, even something that can seem so innocent to normal people like you, watch out, because someone else considers it hostile working environment. So this is why there's no strict liability, because there's so much interpretation and perception, okay? This woman interpreted this, she tried to say it was sexual. Of course, it was not at all. It was a silly play on words. It had nothing to do with anything, which, of course, is exactly what the employer ended up saying. But sadly, of course, this went into this person's personnel record. But that's why there's no strict liability, because one person can say something silly like that, another person interprets it in a ridiculous way. So no, she could not have gone to court and tried to file hostile working environment based on that. So there's no strict liability. What is the employer's responsibility in all this? First of all, first and foremost, one of the most important things, prevention. Taking all necessary steps to prevent sexual harassment from occurring. One of the worst things that an employer can do is to just make up some very, very boring online little presentation you go through every single year. It's the exact same thing, and then you have to sign something saying that you watched it every single year. Well, how many times can you watch that before you're not watching it and you no longer care? Okay, so when we start talking about taking all the necessary steps to prevent sexual harassment, training is incredibly important, and not just training, but meaningful training. Bringing the subject up. This is a very uncomfortable subject for a lot of people. It needs to be addressed by the employer. And the employer has to set the example. They have to set the tone and the culture by expressing strong disapproval and true disapproval, not wink, wink, nudge, nudge, eye roll, yeah, we don't want to get in trouble for this type of attitude, but hey, this is wrong and we are not doing it. and then developing the appropriate sanctions so that if it does go on, everyone knows ahead of time there are serious sanctions to this, and if you get caught doing this, there are going to be repercussions. Informing the employees of their right to actually raise the issue themselves, that they have the right to bring this up and say, listen, there's some things going on around here. I don't think this is right. I think this could be considered a hostile environment and we need to talk about this without the employee being afraid. They need to be able to bring this up to management and telling the employees specifically the steps to go through to address it. To whom does the person speak? Where do they go? Do they have to fill out a form? Can it be informal? Do they go to human resources? Do they go to their direct supervisor? The employees have to know what to do. And then developing methods to sensitize those concerned, because one of the big problems, again, goes back to that Judge Damon Keith quotation about the reasonable person standard. Well, what's reasonable? Because we all have differing perceptions on that. So, again, you could end up with a culture of, oh, this is so stupid, I can't believe we have to do this, everyone's so worried about being politically correct. No, they really, really need to be sensitized. My spouse works for the government, and of course every year they have to go through all these different trainings, and year after year the employees get very, very tired of it. Well, one year my husband came home very, very upset because he had to watch a training on human trafficking, and all the guys that worked for him were up in arms because they were so distraught having watched it. And they travel, and sometimes they travel internationally. Therefore, what they were being taught was how to look for the signs that this is going on, what you should watch out for, what you should report. Really important. So many of them, now this was, you guys, this was years ago, didn't know that this existed, and they had to be sensitized to it. It had to be brought to them at a level where they understood it was going on. And in this case, because it so happens that children so often, of course, all these guys, were just absolutely horrified by what they had to watch. But, and you guys, it wasn't really graphic or anything. I don't mean that. They were just horrified by the idea that this even existed. Because again, we've talked about how we project our own goodness onto other people, and then when it's suddenly brought to you so clearly that not everyone is good and nice, it can be pretty devastating. So they were rapidly sensitized to this issue. Sexual harassment, now how do you sensitize people to that? I mean, it's really difficult. And what can you show them that's reasonable, that you can show at work or in your training, to bring this home? And I think that one of the best things is when somebody is willing to stand up and talk about what's happened to them. And I think one of the most shocking things for everybody that helps to sensitize them is when it's a man. It's a man that actually talks about their experience with sexual harassment. So you have to find a way to make it a meaningful training to sensitize people to it so they don't think it's an eye roll and a no big deal and this is so stupid politically correct stuff, okay? So very, very important that we learn how to sensitize everybody in the organization, particularly the people at the top, because remember, that's where our culture ends up being set, to the entire the idea of preventing, being aware of, and being sensitized to sexual harassment. Now, California law requires employers to have written policies and procedures to prohibit and report sexual harassment. Therefore, every year when you're doing this for your employer, please don't think, oh, I can't believe they make me do this. Guess what? They have no choice. California is very serious about this, and all employers must have a written policy to both report and to prohibit sexual harassment, because remember that the employer has strict liability. So it is very important that they have plans in place to prohibit. Reporting sexual harassment, your procedures must not require the victim to report harassment to the harasser. That might sound silly to you, but what if they told you that the procedure was report this to your immediate supervisor? That's the rule, that's what you have to do. Well, what if your immediate supervisor is the harasser? So you try and go around that and go to somebody else, and they say, too bad. Our policy and procedure is you have to report to your immediate supervisor. So The employer is responsible for putting into place a reporting procedure that allows the person being harassed not to have to report to the harasser, which when you think about it makes complete sense, yes? The policy has to be published to all employees annually, and that is why you are signing something every single year that says that you have read this policy, that you acknowledge this policy, that you understand this policy. So what if you're the victim of sexual harassment? Studies show us that typical victims are timid. When you see the typical victim of sexual harassment, we frequently see younger people who are the victims, and people say, yeah, it's because they're better looking. No, younger people generally in the workplace are easy marks. A true harasser, I'm not talking about the poor little 4Q guy, I'm talking about a true harasser, looks for a victim that is not going to fight back. If you are a victim of sexual harassment, the most important thing you can do is to document everything, dates, times, anything that would jog someone's memory. Like maybe it was on the day of the big luncheon we had for so-and-so's retirement. Do you remember? And sometimes it's those little details that can get another employee to jog their memory to remember something. So if you are ever the victim of sexual harassment, you need to immediately document everything. And then I would also tell you to not leave that documentation at work. Take it with you off-site. Keep it at home. Okay? You don't want to leave all your documentation in your desk and have it disappear. You need to make sure that you report the incident specifically according to company policy. Follow through so that there are no technicalities. The EEOC will not file a claim until you've exhausted internal company remedies. So, if you're ever sexually harassed, I sincerely hope you're not, but you need to know what your rights are. So you need to report the incident to your company. If your company does not take necessary action, again, this is perception, then you file with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, who oversees sexual harassment cases. If you are in a position of being sexually harassed, it's really important that you set boundaries. Nobody can read your mind. If you are sitting there quietly while a hostile environment type situation is going on and you don't speak up, how would they know that you're offended? I mean, and I know what you're all going to say, they should know, but remember, it's perception. And so often we say, how could anybody not know that what they were doing was harassment? Well, some people surprisingly really don't. And you really have to set the boundaries and set them firmly. When we start talking about traditional communication stereotypes, no can mean not yet or maybe to some men. This is a broad stroke generalization, gentlemen. Please don't be insulted. I'm sure you're not one of those people. But studies show us that it is a male communication stereotype, and so which means, right, sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, but that no could mean maybe. Persistence is rewarded as a negotiation strategy. She's just playing hard to get. When in reality, the woman probably really needs no. Many men see flirting as a compliment, so do many women. You should be flattered that I'm bothering to, flirt with you. As silly as it sounds, a lot of people feel like that. Women without any emotional attachment to the man in question may see flirting as intrusive. They don't like that. Again, broad stroke generalizations. Men may think Candace likes it when I flirt with her. What is Constance's problem? Why doesn't she like it? Constance is the issue, and she needs to lighten up. You see me over there, Candace and I are flirting away and it's all good. What's Constance's issue? What, does she have a problem, a stick up her back? I mean, what's her issue? Here's the theme, Constance and Candace. Perception, personal perception, personal tolerance level, yes? Everyone has the right to work in an environment without sexual attention. And some people crave and seek sexual attention so much, even in the workplace, when others are there to do their job. They don't want sexual attention, they don't need sexual attention, and it actually makes them very, very uncomfortable. Men often have a higher offense threshold. And let me explain to you what that means. It is not unusual at work to hear two men have a conversation where one looks at the other and goes, "Dude, how much weight have you gained? What are you, like 450 at this point?" And they go back and forth with these insults. They have a higher offense threshold. Can you imagine saying that to one of your female coworkers? "Chick, what, do you weigh about 450 now? You look like you need a tent on." No, 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 no. I think all of you know that's not going to happen. You would never go to work and just say, to one of your average general coworkers, I'm not talking about your best friend, I'm just talking about, an average female coworker who works around you, and go, "What, you gained about 20 pounds? Those pants look like they're going to split up the back." Ooh, no. Women's offense threshold is usually lower. It's usually lower than the male offense threshold. And the other thing is, you'll see two men go at it at work sometime, arguing, and they're so mad at each other, and later they'll go out after work and have a beer. Not so much with women. If two women are screaming at each other at work and not getting along, you're probably not going to see them go out after work and have a beer, because women's offense threshold is frequently lower than men's. Men may perceive a female's sexual attractiveness as an invitation. Okay, we're not talking about overt displays of sexuality, inappropriate sexual dress at the workplace. We're talking about the average lady who puts on a nice, new, pretty suit and shoes and has her hair and her makeup done, but she's still appropriate, okay? Don't confuse the two. She is dressed appropriately, but very attractively. Men may think she's doing that on purpose to attract male attention, therefore she will be happy to receive it, when the reality could be that women do not see attractive dressing as a generalized invitation for sexual attention. She may have really done it just to look nice. And again, this comes from all the different perceptions in the workplace and the fact that there really are women out there. And we're going to focus on women on this because most men don't dress in an overtly sexual manner. It's just unheard of in our society, where it's very, very much acceptable for women, or even sometimes expected. So that's why this focus is so much on, the way women dress as opposed to men, because I can't fathom a man coming, what's he going to come to work in that's considered highly sexual? I mean, a Speedo, you just don't do that. It doesn't work that way, whereas it certainly can frequently with women work that way. And that's why this one is skewed so much about the way women dress and how men react. So, men may interpret polite resistance as an invitation for pursuit because she's playing hard to get. She's really enjoying this. In fact, she wants even more of my attention. That's why she's playing hard to get. Whereas to a woman, a polite no is an absolute rejection. No means no. When accused of sexual harassment, many men often think that women are overreacting. Those differing perceptions, those differing thresholds, the different socialization about sexuality. So, this is a test. How many times can you ask a coworker out before it becomes sexual harassment? Do you know the answer? Because it's once. You can ask a coworker out and it is not sexual harassment. Once. If you ask more than one time, it can indeed be considered sexual harassment. Now, do we know that people are going to ask each other out in the workplace? Of course we do. Of course we do. History shows us that your employees will tend to date. So we know that employees absolutely date each other. You just have to know that if you ask a coworker out and they say no, that's it. Never ask again. There is no date that is worth your career, correct? And this slide does say that women have the right to a work environment free from unwanted sexual attention. But the truth is, it should say everyone has the right to a work environment free from unwanted sexual attention. So, In our society, women are frequently socialized not to be confrontational, and many women have an extremely difficult time with confrontation and saying no. Polite refusals are sometimes ignored. Um, when someone is truly a harasser, it is important that they be able to save face. And I know a lot of you will say, why should we allow this person to save face? So that nothing escalates and it doesn't become very, very ugly and possibly violent. Anger offends. You need to set your boundaries firmly, but impersonally. Very important that you're not up in somebody's face and embarrassing them. So, specific phrases to use. How typical of a communication strategy is this first one for women? I'm sorry. You are apologizing for saying no. Okay, you have nothing to apologize for. I'm seeing someone else. Boy, that's almost a challenge to, I can make you forget about this other person. In this case, the woman, and this is very much a typical female type communication stereotype, the woman is trying to protect the man's ego and not hurt his feelings, but that message to many men is not heard as a resounding no. Okay? I'm not interested in starting a relationship with you. Done. There's no waffling on that, is there? But a lot of women consider that very confrontational, very rude. When the truth is, the average man would accept that if there was no anger, there was no nastiness. You know, a lot of that statement is in the tone. Just very polite, very state the fact, very matter of fact. I'm not interested in starting a relationship with you, and move on, and it'll probably be the end of it. I've told you 3 times, I am not interested in a relationship with you. Stop trying. Eye contact, very direct tone of voice, but not, again, not anger and confrontation, okay? At this point, if this continues and the person is still coming at you, you really do need to report this and request some assistance from upper management. So how do you not look like a victim? Carry yourself with confidence. Men respect assertiveness but not aggressiveness. Does that make sense? There's a difference between being strong and assertive and being an aggressive confrontational jerk. Know your rights. Know what to do. Don't just sign that sexual harassment policy every year without reading it. Actually know what you're supposed to do and how to report. Don't make it personal. Don't call the person names. Just keep it very much to the facts. I don't want a relationship with you. Please leave me alone. So, let's talk about a survey of U.S. government employees that showed that 19% of men and 44% of women reported experiencing sexually harassing behavior. That's the number that's, I think, surprising to a lot of people. In 2008, there were over 13,000 sexual harassment complaints made to the EEOC. Part of this has to do with perception, right? Norms that vary from culture to culture. So, let's talk about what happens when you do have to file with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. You are most likely to win your case the more severe the harassment was, that you have supporting witnesses, it's not your word against one other person and there's no proof, that you have that documentation we talked about, and that the person complained to their superiors or their management before going to EEOC. Remember, you have to let your company try to fix it first, and that management did not take action. They took no action. The greater number of those factors that are true, the more likely the plaintiff is to win their case when they have to go file for federal action in a sexual harassment case. So what behaviors constitute harassment? You know, one of the things, there's 2 things in this chapter I want you to learn. What to do if you're a victim, but I also think it's really important that you learn how not to be a harasser. And I know when I say that, everyone immediately says, well, I'm not a harasser, what a terrible thing to say. But remember, there's so many different perceptions that I just think it's really important that we also take a look at how to ensure that you're not a harasser. So when we start talking about the behaviors that constitute sexual harassment, obviously sexual bribery, okay, is not acceptable in the workplace. That'd be a quid pro quo. I think that the average person, what gets them in trouble is more hostile environment, verbal comments. It is not acceptable to make a comment about any body part of any employee at work. It is not. It is not acceptable. Okay? And I want you to know that a person can file a sexual harassment complaint based upon overhearing these comments, even if they were not directed towards that person. It can create hostile environment for them. And I have worked at places where employees were sitting around talking about, look at that just went by, and they start to describe specific body parts. Not acceptable. Okay, this is not your personal sexual trolling zone. These are people who are there to work, to be professionals, and you are not allowed to make comments about any one of their body parts or any type of sexual comment, no matter what the person looks like. Nonverbal displays. All right, sexual assault is a felony. Calling it sexual harassment, it just depends on the severity of what we're talking about. Sexual assault is a felony, okay? When we usually start talking about nonverbal sexual harassment, we're talking about touching, and so, oh, it was just an accident, I didn't mean to, and materials. I think we've all had somebody rub up against us at some point, and you know darn well it wasn't an accident. You know what? That's illegal. You cannot do that. You shouldn't be rubbing any part of your body against another employee. Period. End of statement. Again, I'm not talking about silliness. Somebody staggers in a hallway or the hallway's really packed. I'm talking, you guys know the difference, right? You know the difference. What is personal space in this society? How do you define it? Well, the average person can't define it. They can't tell me how far it is, but if I stood next to you, we could do a little exercise, and at some point you would know immediately what was not culturally acceptable to us if I got too close to you. It's 12 to 18 inches depending upon the circumstances. Now, if a coworker has a report on their desk and you have to bend over looking down their report, you're pointing something, that's different, okay? You don't have a problem with that coworker doing that as long as they keep their eyes on the report, right? But in general conversation, general behaviors at work, Americans are very specific about this little bubble we have around us that we don't want you getting too close. There's actually a Seinfeld about that, about the close talker, right? And about these people who get up too close to you because it's not acceptable in our culture. But I want you to remember that people who come from other cultures frequently have a very different idea about personal space. And their idea of personal space could be that it doesn't exist, or it's much, much smaller than Americans because we come from a big country where we have a lot of space. And not all cultures have that. So I want you to be aware of personal space and how close you get to people. And in particular, you shouldn't be touching somebody at work. Sexually oriented behavior is considered more severe when we have a power inequity. All right, this is a person at a higher level in the company than the victim. That is a really important thing to know because that's an abuse of power and the courts really don't like that, okay? That's abusing your position. The harasser has behaved similarly toward the victim and others over time, which is a continuing violation. Okay, when somebody files a sexual harassment suit, it is very, very common to find out later that other victims existed, and frequently other victims will start coming forward. There was a case a few years ago out on Edwards where the Air Force had hired a civilian company. They outsourced some of their security work. You know, the people who check your badges when you go in and out and make sure everything's secure. Well, they outsourced it to a company that was doing it. Well, they ended up with a male employee who quit and then filed a huge sexual harassment case against them because his boss, his direct supervisor, was sexually harassing him verbally, constantly making sexual comments to him. Um, and it got to the point where he had to quit. He couldn't take it anymore. And it was a pretty blatant case. Well, after he filed, guess what happened? Like 4 or 5 more victims came out and said, yeah, he did the same thing to me, and had some evidence and said, I just quit and left. I couldn't take it anymore. Okay. You've got a supervisor, and now they have multiple employees who have quit because of his harassment. This is huge. It's a power inequity. He used his position as a supervisor, and he was doing things like not giving them the right shifts if they weren't receptive to his sexual advances. I mean, it was pretty bad, which means, number 3, there were job consequences for these victims. Having to quit your job because your supervisor is harassing you is a pretty big job consequence, don't you think? But there were some other things, like they weren't going to get the promotions, and they weren't going to get, good shifts because, security guards work 24/7, 365. So there were definitely some other consequences. And needless to say, that security company lost their contract, and the victims won. They won this case. It was pretty bad. And that was male on male sexual harassment. Now, there are some different ideas about the explanation for why people sexually harass other people. But we're going to continue that in the next discussion. I actually went a little bit farther than I had planned to. So, there are 2 sections to this lecture. You will receive the next section next week. In order to receive your points for this particular section, I want you to go to your personal discussion board and post a thread with the subject line quid pro quo. Quid pro quo, prior to the last day of this week, which would be Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Okay, again, 2 sections. You have to listen to both sections, and obviously in the next section there will be another thing you have to go post to receive the full points for this week. So please go to your personal discussion board and post a thread with the subject line quid pro